Quicksand of Betrayal. Chapter 1. Nestled amidst idyllic landscapes, the mansion stood as a testament to a forgotten era of affluence and inherited wealth. Its imposing stone exterior, adorned with intricate carvings and embraced by verdant vines clinging to its centuries-old walls, whispered stories of bygone days to those courageous enough to approach. This historical relic sprawled as an homage to the opulence and prestige of its owner, Paul, a man whose roots were deeply intertwined with the very soul of the mansion. Within the mansion's walls existed an enchanting fusion of timeless elegance and luxury. Towering ceilings soared above, adorned with ornate chandeliers casting a warm, golden glow upon the gleaming marble floors below. Lavish tapestries adorned the walls, chronicling the family's storied history, while antique furnishings and invaluable works of art punctuated the grandeur of each room. On one fateful evening, bathed in the gentle radiance of crystal chandeliers, Paul, his graceful and stunning wife, Grace, and his younger brother, Mike, gathered around an enormous dining table. As the moon's silvery beams filtered through antique windows, the trio engaged in a lively conversation about their extensive wealth and the myriad businesses they had accumulated over the years. The room exuded an air of privilege, and its walls absorbed every whispered word and subtle gesture, echoing them through the annals of history. Within this mansion of opulence and mysteries, the stage was set for an evening that would peel back the layers of refinement and reveal the true essence of its inhabitants. The maid, Sarah, a woman in her early 20s, entered the room to serve refreshments. Mike, Paul's younger brother, made an inappropriate advance, spanking her behind hard, but Sarah, concerned about her job, maintained her silence and continued with her duties. Paul reprimanded Mike for his impolite and disrespectful behavior towards the maid. Mike shrugged off his brother's admonishment, responding with condescension. Sarah, feeling slightly uncomfortable, remained quiet and retreated toward the kitchen, casting a fleeting glance at Paul and offering a playful smile. Noticing the maid's furtive glances towards her husband, Paul's wife, Grace, glared at the young woman as she disappeared into the kitchen. Grace had always regarded Sarah as beneath her, and she felt the need to assert that status. Grace excused herself from the table and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Sarah preparing their dinner. Sarah turned to face the imposing woman, who, with disdain, slapped the maid across the face, sending her to the cold kitchen floor, and declaring that she was nothing more than trash. As Sarah lay on the floor, holding her face in pain, Grace continued to berate her, mocking her for not finishing high school and for being a single mother living in a trailer park. She insisted that the maid should never look at her or her husband, as a dog should know its place. Sarah, crying and terrified, apologized and assured Grace it would never happen again. Grace, reveling in her sense of superiority, continued her verbal assault, instructing the maid to keep her gaze fixed on the floor, just as a dog should. At that moment, Paul intervened, his anger evident as he questioned, "What the hell is going on?" Unfazed by his inquiry, Grace walked away, maintaining her arrogant and superior demeanor, whispering that she was merely reminding the maid of her place. Paul shot his wife a furious look as she departed and then turned to Sarah, who was still in tears on the floor. He approached her, helping her up and offering comfort, ensuring she was all right. After settling her into a chair, Paul retrieved a towel, dampened it with cold water from the fridge, and gently applied it to her swollen face. Sarah, avoiding eye contact, felt her cheeks flush from his touch and recalled Grace's cruel words. Breaking the silence, Paul apologized for his wife and brother's behavior, acknowledging that they were terrible people. Tearfully, Sarah whispered that it wasn't his fault, and that maybe his wife was right, she was nothing but trash. Paul interrupted her, refusing to believe that and insisting she shouldn't either. He assured her that he wouldn't have hired her if he thought she was trash, offering a comforting smile. Sarah finally managed a smile and a soft chuckle, thinking what a compassionate man he was. There was a brief moment when the world seemed to stand still, and their eyes locked. Then, in a hushed voice, she whispered something to him, causing his eyes to widen. Just then, a cough interrupted them, and it was Mike, his insidious brother, inquiring if he was returning to the table, as they were waiting for him. Paul told Sarah she could leave, and he would handle the rest of the evening. Sarah reluctantly agreed, gathered her purse and coat, and headed out the door. After she had departed, Mike made a crude comment, insinuating an inappropriate relationship. With an evil chuckle he says, "You tapping that ass?" while gazing at Paul. Paul chastised Mike, calling him a pig and demanding that he cease his inappropriate behavior. Back at the table, Paul brought out the plates of food and sat down. His wife, Grace, asked where the maid was, and before he could respond, his brother, Mike, suggested that Paul had given his mistress the night off. Grace insisted that her husband would never touch a woman like the maid, whom she regarded as beneath her. At the end of his nerves, Paul yelled at them to both shut up, making Mike and Grace jump as they had never seen Paul react this way before. Even Paul's wife, Grace, was worried, never having seen this side of him. Grace and Mike exchanged concerned looks and then turned their gazes back to Paul, who was now carving a piece of meat from the tender steak prepared by Sarah. After a few moments of uncomfortable silence at the table, Paul looked at the two perplexed individuals with a stern gaze. He chastised Grace, reminding her that she used to be a caring person before they married and that the old her would have never looked down on another person like she had done to the maid that night. He emphasized that even his grandfather had never finished 5th grade but still managed to build a great company and become one of the richest men in the world. Grace looked down, unable to show any hints of remorse. Paul then turned to his brother, labeling him a perverted drunk in need of help. Both Grace and Mike remained silent, like two scolded children. Just as Paul was about to speak again, he noticed something was wrong. His throat went dry, and he sensed something was amiss. Panic washed over his face as he noticed something sprinkled on top of his steak. He looked at the two individuals at the table, and it became clear that they were responsible for his condition. Desperation and fear overtook him as he gasped for air, realizing he was experiencing a severe allergic reaction. Paul struggled to breathe, reaching out for help from the two individuals who had orchestrated this sinister plot. But instead of assistance, he saw his wife, Grace, and brother, Mike, exchange a passionate kiss, revealing their treacherous alliance. Paul's mind raced as he grasped the betrayal before him. He had been a fool, too blind to see what had been happening right under his nose. Grace, after kissing Mike, posed before Paul, taunting him about the toppings she had added to his steak, finely ground peanuts, something he had been allergic to all his life. An image of his devoted maid flashed in his mind, and he realized the extent of the conspiracy. His wife, Grace, and brother, Mike, had plotted his demise, and the blame would fall on Sarah. Grace stood back up, still smiling, and walked into the living room to the fireplace, her slender fingers trailing over the end of a poker iron. Her expression turned to one of hatred as she returned to Paul, striking him across the face with the iron from the fireplace, calling him useless trash. Darkness descended upon Paul. Moments later, in the back of the house, Grace and Mike walked back from an isolated area. To the side, there was a sign warning of quicksand. Groggy and panicked, Paul woke up, realizing the dire situation he was in. He felt weightless, and as he looked around, he noticed the two traders walking away, pushing a wheelbarrow. He tried to call out for help, even from these devils, hoping for a glimmer of pity, but he couldn't make a sound. Second by second, he sank deeper into the quicksand, his chest constricting, and the air being squeezed out of him. It was a horrific way to die, and Paul cursed those who had betrayed him, not wanting to meet his end this way. Chapter 2. Inside the mansion, the sounds of wild passion echoed through the vacant halls. Upstairs in the master bedroom, Mike and Grace were drenched in sweat from their marathon of desires. Grace, on top, boasted that she was in control and poured an expensive brand of wine down her exposed body. Mike, consumed by lust, eagerly lapped up the wine like a devoted dog. Downstairs, a strange noise interrupted their passionate moment, sending shivers down their spines. Both dressed inappropriately, they cautiously crept down the spiral staircase, with Mike leading and a pistol in hand, ready to confront the intruder. Grace clung to his back, her nervousness palpable. The strange noise persisted, emanating from the kitchen. Mike flipped on the lights, and to their shock, they found Sarah there. Their initial reaction was one of terror, and all three screamed in surprise. Mike, holding the gun, cursed under his breath, and Grace asked why the hell she was in the house. Apologizing, Sarah exclaimed she had gotten to the bus stop and realized she had forgotten her house keys in a terrified voice. Displaying her keys that she had found in the drawer beside the stove, she tried to explain. Mike looked at her and told her she was lucky because he almost shot her for sneaking back into the house. Sarah once more apologized for startling them, saying that it was not her intention. Then an uncomfortable moment washed over the trio. Standing before Sarah, she noticed Mike was in his briefs and no shirt, and Grace was in her nightgown and underwear. Uncontrollably, Sarah nervously asked where Paul was, her gaze tracing to the gun, considering the worst. Realizing the situation, the two laughed in an uncomfortable way, trying to throw Sarah off and saying this is not what it looks like. That Mike was spending the night, and Paul had drunk too much and was passed out in the bedroom upstairs. Sarah stood there, still frozen, not truly believing these two and ready to run if they moved towards her. God, you're scaring the poor girl, Grace said, grabbing the gun from Mike. With a stern gaze for Mike to leave, she turned with a warm, motherly smile at Sarah, saying that she was sorry for Mike's rudeness and how he can be such an uncultured savage. Whatever, I am going to get another drink, Mike spoke rudely, waving off the two women. Sarah still made no movement, still not trusting this woman's words. Grace stood before her, and then realizing this might be a problem, Grace's warm demeanor changed to one of fury. With the gun brandished beside her, Grace slowly walked towards the girl, like a lion playing with its prey. This girl was nothing but garbage, and she would have to be dealt with just like Paul. If she killed her now, they could just toss her into the pit like him as well. No one would know or even care if she was missing, Grace thought, looking the frightened Sarah over. In her eyes, Sarah could see the murderous intent emitting from her. She panicked, with her mind racing to find a way out of this situation. She glanced over at the kitchen knife on the table. But it was too far, and Grace was too close for her to reach it in time. She knew she had killed Paul, and she was next. She started to cry, whispering, please, and that she had a little boy at home. Slowly, the gun raised, pointed at the forehead of Sarah. Grace arrogantly called her trash and started to pull the trigger. In the next second, a loud crash and Mike's screams vibrated throughout the house and in the kitchen. While keeping the gun trained on Sarah, Grace anxiously glanced over her shoulder, urgently calling out Mike's name, but received no response. Her initial look of concern gradually shifted to one of worry, then morphed into a hint of fear as she returned her attention to Sarah, who seemed increasingly bewildered and frightened. Something was wrong. Gesturing with the gun, Grace urged Sarah to lead the way through the house while she followed closely with her pistol at the ready. They proceeded into the next room, which was shrouded in darkness. Once again, Grace whispered Mike's name into the void, and once again, there was no answer. She tried the light switch, but the lights remained stubbornly off. Frustration mingled with fear as Grace reached back into the kitchen for an emergency flashlight hanging on the wall. Turning it on, she thrust it into Sarah's trembling hands, instructing her to keep it forward to illuminate their path. The two women advanced cautiously, navigating the dimly lit house with trepidation, using the flashlight to pierce the darkness in each room they entered. As they turned a corner, they stumbled upon the adjoining living room, still bathed in darkness. Grace made one more futile attempt to activate the lights with the wall switch, but it yielded no results. In the room's faint illumination, they noticed moonlight pouring in through open glass doors. Their home had been infiltrated, someone had broken in. Oh God, Grace whispered anxiously, her voice hushed. The thought of Paul being alive briefly crossed her mind, but she dismissed it as impossible. He had perished, and the peanuts had played a part in his demise, ensuring it with the sand trap. No, Paul couldn't be responsible for this intrusion. Grace's mind raced with images from horror movies, masked killers and ghosts, and fear took hold of her. Her gun swung in all directions, anticipating an assailant lurking in the shadows, ready to strike. Then, from the side, a low moan reached their ears. Both women spun around, the flashlight's beam revealing a dark figure emerging from behind the sofa, sending shivers down their spines. In sheer panic, Grace screamed, "Damn you!" and emptied her gun in the direction of the unidentified figure, some bullets piercing the wall and the sofa. Sarah recoiled, covering her ears, while Grace, in her frenzied state, laughed hysterically, triumphantly watching the man collapse to the floor. She believed she had confronted the masked slasher from her nightmares and emerged victorious. With a sense of arrogance, Grace berated the shaken Sarah, referring to her as useless trash, before striding over to the lifeless figure. However, as the flashlight's beam ascended the body, Grace's shock was palpable. Trembling lips and tear-filled eyes replaced her earlier bravado as she beheld the bloodied corpse of Mike. She had unwittingly killed the wrong man. Behind her, slow footsteps approached, the crunch of sand on the wooden floor growing louder. Overwhelmed by fear, Grace turned to face the intruder, screaming and pulling the trigger, only to realize her gun was empty. She froze, her eyes widening with terror. The mysterious figure before her, concealed by the darkness, raised an iron poker and delivered a powerful blow to the side of her head. The world faded to black. Chapter 3. Confused by the wound on her head, Grace's blurry vision finally focused on a hushed voice attempting to communicate with her. Gradually, her senses returned, and she saw Sarah and Paul standing over her. Panic surged through her as she realized she was tied to her deceased lover and, shockingly, found herself submerged in the very same quicksand pit where they had previously disposed of Paul. "It's about time you woke up. Just a few more minutes, and it might have been too late for me to bid you farewell," Paul quipped while gazing at her. Grace struggled to find words, overwhelmed by the surreal situation and the surreal presence of her deceased husband speaking to her. "How are you alive?" "Well, you see, this amazing lady whom you've repeatedly scorned and believed yourself superior to," he began, pointing toward the smirking Sarah at his side, "she witnessed you tampering with my food." Stunned, Grace shifted her gaze to the insolent look on Sarah's face. Paul went on to commend Sarah for her quick thinking during their earlier confrontation in the kitchen, where she had surreptitiously added something to his meal. Unfortunately for Grace, Sarah had seen her actions, yet cleverly feigned ignorance. Later, when Paul was in the kitchen, he divulged that Sarah had discreetly informed him of Grace's misdeed and cautioned him to be vigilant. This led to Paul devising a plan to play along with Grace's charade, hoping to set a trap for both her and his late brother. He suspected that Grace and Mike had conspired against him, planning his murder, seizing his assets, and laying blame on Sarah. Consequently, he had feigned a seizure and played his part, but he hadn't anticipated Grace's fiery temper getting the best of her. It was at that point that he surmised Grace had realized the police wouldn't believe her tale of Sarah killing him. Especially when there was a head-wound cause from a fire poker earlier that night. So, in desperation, she had tried to dispose of the evidence in the quicksand. Fortunately, Sarah had remained at the mansion, silently observing the entire ordeal and rescuing Paul from the sand trap. She had even served as a distraction to allow him to enter from the rear, though he had momentarily overlooked the gun upstairs, which could have had dire consequences. He went on to reveal that he had known about her affair with his brother for years, harboring a desire for a divorce but fearing she would strip him of everything, despite the damning evidence he possessed against her and Mike. Upon hearing the full narrative, Grace erupted in anger, hurling insults at Sarah, deeming her worthless and even disparaging her son as a bastard who didn't deserve to breathe the same air. Paul leaned down, fixing her with an intense, menacing gaze, and delivered a chilling admonition, Never speak to Sarah or her child in that manner, you are the only trash I see here." Grace was utterly dumbfounded, as if a bolt of lightning had struck her brain. "What?" was all she could manage, her head swiveling between Paul's steely glare and Sarah's malevolent smirk. The tables had turned, and Grace found herself overmatched. Paul retrieved a long, slender branch from the ground and pressed it against Grace's forehead, urging her to sink faster. With a sigh, Paul stood up, declaring his boredom with the conversation. Saying goodbye to Grace, he turned away and began to walk off with Sarah beside him. As they departed, the echoes of Grace's protests faded to whispers and eventually silence. 2 years later, off the coast of South Carolina, a beach house basked in the morning sun's warm glow. The tranquil sounds of the ocean waves caressing the shore mingled with the laughter and chatter of beachgoers strolling along, hand in hand, searching for seashells. Inside the beach house, Sarah gazed out at the picturesque view, a scene she had come to cherish since she and Paul had relocated there. She admired the ring he had given her a year ago, following his divorce and the disappearance of his ex-wife and brother. He had sold the family estate, established a few small businesses in town, and Sarah had transitioned into the role of a stay-at-home mom. Despite Paul's intentions to hire help for household chores, she insisted on maintaining the house herself, affirming that she was the only maid in his life. From behind, warm hands encircled Sarah, placing soft kisses on her neck, and a gentle morning whisper tickled her ear as Paul embraced her. As she leaned back into his arms, exchanging morning greetings with her husband, she whispered her contentment, and Paul responded with another happiness as well. In the background, a 3-year-old was seated at the table, creating a delightful mess with crayons and giggling at the colorful chaos on the paper. Holding up his masterpiece with a beaming grin, he declared, "Look what I drew, Daddy." Paul and Sarah chuckled together, praising their son's talents and boosting the young child's ego. 2 years in this tranquil coastal haven had transformed their lives. Paul had indeed found the simplicity he craved, and the love he and Sarah shared blossomed. They had embraced a life by the beach, where their days were filled with the soothing sounds of the ocean, leisurely walks along the shore, and quality time as a family. The past was a distant memory, and their hearts were now filled with contentment and happiness.